Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of January 8th, and this is your first Monday briefing of 2024.
Last week may have seemed like a quiet start to the year, but that changed over the weekend. With less than 2 weeks until the January 19th government funding deadline, congressional leaders may have reached a deal to avert a government shutdown. To find out what happened and what's to come, I'm going to talk with Scott and our guest, Karl Russo, who leads PwC's National Economic and Statistics practice, who also will shed some light on the latest employment numbers. Karl, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Scott, I want to come to you first. Could you talk about the agreement and what needs to happen between now and January 19th, and a reminder for our viewers about the content of this agreement?
Sure, Sindhu. Just to level set for our viewers, we're currently operating the federal government under Continuing Resolution, or CR, as they probably well remember from late in 2023. But that expires in 2 tranches, the first of which hits on January 19th, the second on February 2nd. And you might have seen relative inactivity from Congress, not just because of the holiday break, but because of one key hurdle that they needed to clear in order to begin this whole process. And that was agreeing on a top line number. What is the overall spending target that they have agreed upon from the White House, which is Democratic, to the Senate, which is Democratic, and the House, which is in Republican hands, as we know. They needed to come together to agree on what that top line number would be so that then each of the appropriators could go back and write their bills to hit that top line number. Well, that's the news that came out over the weekend, that they seem to have agreed on a roughly $1.6 trillion budget, and that will allow them to go do their work. Now, the concern is that even though they've reached this agreement, trying to execute on this agreement between now and that first January 19th deadline is not easy. Even though they have 2 weeks, that still is not a lot of time for them to get this done. So even though the first hurdle has been cleared, there's still a lot that remains in order for them to avoid any kind of shutdown or government interruption as we get forward. But at least we have the potentially good news that this is now a ball that is rolling.
Excellent. And Karl, whenever we start talking in trillions, I am really glad that there's an economist in the room. So give us some perspective on this. What happens to the economy if this agreement sees the light of day and if it doesn't?
Yeah, so the agreement has a top line number for discretionary spending of about $1.6 trillion, and that is largely consistent with the deal that was reached on the debt limit last year. And if they are able to follow through on that, then we avoid the government shutdown and all of the dislocation for the economy that would come as a result of that. Not only just for the government employees who would be not working, but they wouldn't be spending their money on all of the private sector businesses with the income that they would expect to have during that period. And so that removal of that uncertainty is generally a positive for the economy. Right. If we don't see the agreement get resolved in time, then we go through the process of the dislocation in the economy that would come with the government shutdown. And that might depend on how long it lasts and whether or not all of the agencies of the government remain unfunded or whether they're able to come together with at least some of the appropriations bills passing in time.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And Scott, let me come back to you. So what happens if this doesn't get enacted and we get to January 19th and nothing's done?
So, Sindhu, there are really 2 parts to this answer. One has to do with the dislocations, as Karl mentioned, that might result if, in fact, we don't get a deal and there is a government shutdown. But I think for our viewers, what we really want to focus on is the tax deal. At the end of last year, we still weren't quite all the way to completing a tax deal, even though its contours seemed clear, that they would include some kind of fix for the research expense issue, for the interest deduction limitation issue, for bonus depreciation, and combine that with the Democratic ask around child tax credit. So the contours of a deal have been there for some time, and that seems like the package that could move forward, perhaps with some adjustments to it. But that's the idea. But it wasn't quite ready to go because it's looking for a vehicle. This spending bill has long been considered the ideal or at least potentially best vehicle on which it could ride to get over the finish line to enactment. So we're watching this with keen interest, not just because we want to see what will happen with the economy and whether we avoid a shutdown, but whether this deal can carry the tax bill over the finish line. That's going to be one of the most critical things that we're watching. So if it doesn't get done, then we're on a potentially slippery slope looking for other hooks on which the tax deal could hang.
So, Karl, I want to come back to you. Scott just mentioned, we're anxiously watching the tax component of this, and you mentioned earlier that this is largely what was done last year. So what is different? And that was fraught with some political issues. So talk about where that stands now.
Yeah, so what's different, I think, about this deal is that each side has got some components of it that weren't there before that they can look at it and take away favorably as sort of developments from that. So on the Republican side in the House, the adjustments to the baseline levels of spending allow them to look and say, hey, we're reducing spending in the future by maybe as much as a couple $100 billion, as the speaker has said. On the Democratic side, there are higher levels of non-defense discretionary spending, which are something that they wanted relative to that prior year deal. And so it's possible that those two components come together with other differences that have been part of the discussion will make this deal a more viable alternative for not only the underlying spending proposal, but also for the attachment of something like the tax extenders deal that business community has been interested in.
Okay, thank you. And we can't let you leave without talking about jobs. The latest numbers show 216,000 jobs added in December, and this is the 36th consecutive month with a gain. So it sounds like great news. So what's your take on it?
Yeah, so the number that came out at 216,000, it was above what many economists had expected for last month. And so that is a positive development. There were some revisions to the prior months that reduced the monthly jobless gains there by about 71,000. And so that's a little bit of a negative. Also, the relative strength of that number might mean that the Fed needs to keep interest rates higher longer than was originally expected. And so I think that's something that's weighed into the market expectations.
Karl, we've also seen some wage growth over this time. So can you talk a little bit about the impact that wage growth has on inflation, the Fed's decision with regard to inflation, and maybe even workforce participation?
Yeah, so one of the components of the jobs report was that wages have grown by about 4% over the prior 12-month period. And that is something that the Fed has watched to make sure that it's not contributing toward the services component of inflation pressures. And one of the things that we've looked for there is to see whether productivity catches up. If you have productivity gains of about 2% and an inflation target of about 2%, you can sustain wage growth of about 4%. And so that's one thing that we'll keep an eye on. Productivity had been lagging pretty terribly and has caught up, at least in some of the early indications of last year. We'll see if that's sustained. The other piece that is concerning on the inflation side is that the labor force participation rate was actually down in this latest report. That increase in labor supply, along with some of the effect of the higher interest rates on demand for labor, had been leading to some rebalancing in the labor market that was very favorable on the inflation side. So if we've undone some of that progress on labor force participation, that's something, again, that the Fed's going to want to have to pay attention to and perhaps, again, keep rates higher longer.
Interesting. Okay, Karl, thank you as always for your insights. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
And for our viewers, also airing today is my interview with Jen Spang on new FASB guidance on income tax disclosures. A lot of great insight and detail which you would not want to miss. And coming up Friday, a new episode of Week in Review.
Finally, if you have questions about what to expect for tax policy this year, look no further than PwC's 2024 Tax Policy Outlook, which comes out this Thursday. We'll also talk about it here later this week, and the Outlook will be the focus of a January 17th webcast. A link to register for that webcast is in the description of this episode. A lot going on, and there's a lot more to come. We appreciate you spending this time with us, and we'll see you next time. Take care.